The blizzard had stolen everything: warmth, strength, time. Buried in the endless snow, a German shepherd lay still, its fur drenched and frozen solid. Each breath was shallow, each heartbeat weaker than the last. It had run for miles, fought against the cold, but now, this was the end. The world was fading, the howling wind growing distant. Had it come all this way just to be forgotten? Or was there still someone out there, searching for it too? Ethan Carter stood by the window, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hands. He had spent 5 years in this cabin, living in quiet isolation on the edge of the Colorado wilderness. 5 years since the accident. 5 years since Anna. The world had moved on without him, and he had let it. It was easier to disappear than to face what remained. Out here, among the trees and the snow, he didn't have to think about the life he left behind. He didn't have to think about faith or hope or the pain of losing someone he loved. But this morning, something felt off. A nagging unease had settled in his chest the moment he woke up, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the silence. The kind that only came after a storm had stripped the world bare. Maybe it was the way the wind had died so suddenly, leaving the air unnaturally still. Or maybe it was something else. He sighed, setting the coffee down on the table before pulling on his coat. The storm had been a bad one, and he needed to check the property, make sure nothing had been damaged. The weight of the cold hit him immediately as he stepped outside, crisp and biting against his skin. Then he saw it, a dark shape barely visible against the snow, lying motionless a few yards ahead. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His first thought was that it was a fallen deer, but as he stepped closer, the details sharpened. A body, thin legs, the faint outline of a tail. He quickened his pace, heart pounding against his ribs. The animal lay sprawled on its side, half buried in the snow, its fur soaked and frozen stiff. Its body was unnaturally still, ribs faintly visible beneath its damp, matted coat. Snow clung to its face, its ears drooped, lifeless. He crouched beside it, brushing the frost away from its muzzle. It was a German shepherd, or at least what was left of one. He hesitated, eyes scanning for any sign of life. Then, a shallow breath. The exhale was faint, barely visible in the freezing air, but it was there. The dog was alive. His hands moved instinctively, searching for injuries, but what he found instead made him freeze. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he wiped the frost away from its surface. Then he saw it. A name, etched into the metal, weathered but unmistakable. His pulse roared in his ears. He stared at the engraving, the letters biting into his mind like the cold against his skin. His name, on a collar, around the neck of a dog he had never seen before. A wave of something deeply unsettling crept up his spine. It was something else entirely. So how the hell was this one wearing his name? Ethan pushed through the cabin door, kicking it shut against the howling wind. Snow clung to his coat, melting into small puddles on the wooden floor as he hurried inside. The German shepherd lay limp in his arms, its body still cold and unresponsive. Setting it down near the fireplace, Ethan grabbed the thickest blanket he could find and wrapped it tightly around the dog's frail frame. He crouched beside it, rubbing its stiff legs, trying to restore circulation. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, but the warmth had yet to reach the creature beside him. "Come on," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "Stay with me." Its breath was faint, barely a whisper against the silence of the cabin. He needed to act fast. Ethan hurried to the stove, filling a pot with water and setting it to boil. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, habits from a lifetime ago, from when he had spent his days caring for animals instead of hiding from the world. He grabbed an old towel, soaking it in the warm water before kneeling beside the dog again. As he ran the damp cloth over its icy fur, he felt how deeply the cold had settled into its body. Every strand of fur was wet and frozen, clumped together in stiff patches. If it had been out in the storm much longer, it wouldn't have made it. His gaze drifted back to the collar. The name on the front still sent an uneasy chill through him. But now, with the dog safe inside, he had time to look closer. He turned the metal between his fingers, brushing away more frost. There, etched faintly on the back, another message. "Bring him home." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Home!" His own voice echoed in his head. What home? The words sent a wave of confusion crashing over him. Who had written this? Where was home supposed to be? He looked down at the German shepherd, at Max, if that was really its name, and tried to piece it together. This dog hadn't just wandered here by accident. Someone, somewhere, had wanted it to find him. Or maybe it had wanted to find him all along. He pushed the thought aside and stood up. His heart was pounding, but not from the cold. He turned toward the far corner of the room, where a worn wooden dresser stood covered in dust. He hadn't opened those drawers in years, but something told him he needed to now. He reached for the bottom drawer, tugging it open. Inside, buried beneath old flannel shirts and forgotten keepsakes, was a stack of papers. His fingers brushed against an envelope, the edges curled with age. Ethan hesitated before pulling it out. The paper had yellowed with time, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Anna Carter. His breath caught in his throat. The name of the adopter, Anna Carter. The name of the dog, Max. A shaky breath left his lips. Anna had adopted a dog. This dog. A gift for Ethan. He needs a companion, even if I'm not here. His hands trembled. He could hear her voice, soft and full of warmth, as if she was standing beside him, whispering in his ear. Even if I'm not here. Ethan gripped the paper tightly, his knuckles turning white. Anna had planned this before the accident, before everything fell apart, before she was gone. But he had never known. He had disappeared, just like the world had disappeared from him. He had never shown up to the shelter, never brought Max home. And yet, here he was, after 5 years, and a dog shouldn't be able to do this, shouldn't be able to wait this long. But Max had. Somehow, against all logic, against the impossible, Max had found his way back. Ethan dropped onto the old wooden chair beside the fireplace, staring blankly at the papers in his hands. His mind swirled with too many emotions, too many unanswered questions. It was absurd. It didn't make sense. And yet, deep inside, in a part of him he had long since buried, he felt something stir, fate, or something greater. His gaze drifted back to Max, still curled in the blanket, its breathing slow but steady. 5 years. Where had he been? How had he survived? And more than anything else, how had he found his way back? Ethan had intended to stay awake through the night, to watch over Max and ensure he pulled through, but exhaustion crept up on him. Somewhere between rubbing warmth back into the dog's frozen limbs and listening to the rhythmic crackling of the fire, his body gave in. Sleep took him in the old armchair beside the hearth, where the heat of the flames kept the winter's cold at bay. When he stirred awake, the morning light had already crept through the frosted window panes, casting a golden glow across the wooden floor. At first, he barely remembered falling asleep at all. But then, he heard the soft sound of breathing. He sat up sharply, eyes falling to the bundle of blankets near the fireplace. Max was awake, deep brown, unwavering, locked onto him with a look that sent a strange warmth through his chest. Recognition. Trust. Ethan hesitated, then slowly extended his hand towards the dog, expecting hesitation or fear. Instead, Max pushed his nose forward, lightly pressing against Ethan's palm. A simple, instinctive motion. A greeting, a bond. Ethan swallowed against the lump forming in his throat. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but something about that small gesture struck him harder than anything had in years. Max gave no response, just kept watching him, as if waiting for something. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a pull towards something outside of himself. A silent understanding. As the morning unfolded, Max barely took his eyes off Ethan. Every time he moved around the cabin, the dog followed his every step, with quiet attentiveness. His body was still too weak to move much, but there was an undeniable awareness in him, as though he had finally reached where he was supposed to be. A ridiculous thought, but one that refused to leave his mind. "Where did you come from?" Ethan muttered at one point, more to himself than to the dog. Max only blinked at him, silent as ever. The unease from the previous night still lingered. The collar, the engraving, the old adoption papers from Anna, it was too much to be coincidence. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't alone. A call beyond the door. Later that morning, Ethan bundled himself up to go outside. The firewood pile was running low, and despite everything, life had to go on. It was barely more than a shift of his weight at first, a slow attempt to rise. His limbs trembled under him, muscles still stiff from the cold and weakness, but he was determined. Ethan saw it in the way Max clenched his jaw, the way his paws dragged against the wooden floor as he fought to stand. Ethan turned fully toward him. "Hey, take it easy," he said. "You're still recovering." Max didn't listen. With a low grunt of effort, the German shepherd finally pushed himself upright. His legs were shaky, but he didn't collapse. He stood there, breathing hard, looking up at Ethan, then shifting his gaze toward the open door. The meaning was clear. He wanted to go outside. Ethan frowned. "It's freezing out there. You barely made it through the night." Then another. Slow, deliberate movements. His body protested every inch, but there was a pull in him that Ethan couldn't ignore. Max reached the doorway and paused at the threshold, his gaze locked on the snow-covered world beyond. His ears flicked, his nose twitching as he took in the crisp winter air. And then, ever so slightly, his tail moved, a flicker of recognition, of familiarity. Ethan followed his gaze, trying to see what Max saw. At first it was nothing, just an endless sea of white. But as his eyes adjusted to the light, he noticed something. A single, distinct trail of paw prints leading directly to his cabin. A solitary path. A path that suggested Max had traveled alone. Ethan's chest tightened. "Where did you come from?" he murmured again. Had he been walking for days, weeks? Ethan's mind reeled, but Max had. Max had found his way to him. Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had spent years believing he was meant to be alone, that no one was looking for him, that God had abandoned him just as he had abandoned his faith. And yet here was this dog, one he had never met, yet one that bore his name, one that had waited 5 long years, standing before him, waiting for something more. A gust of wind swept through the trees, stirring the snow. The silence in the air was thick, heavy. Ethan inhaled sharply. For the first time in years he clasped his hands together. His voice came out quiet, barely more than a whisper, but in the vast stillness of the mountains, it felt like a prayer nonetheless. "Lord, did you send him to me?" Ethan Carter stood at the threshold of his cabin, staring down at the German shepherd by his side. The morning air was sharp, the kind that cut through even the thickest coats, yet Max showed no hesitation. He had barely regained his strength, but there was an undeniable purpose in the way he moved, a quiet determination that mirrored the questions racing through Ethan's mind. The single trail of paw prints leading to his cabin still lingered in his thoughts. It was impossible, unbelievable even, that a dog could have traveled such a great distance, survived alone for so long, and found its way directly to him. But Max had, and Ethan needed answers. Ethan secured Max in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck, throwing a blanket over the worn leather seat to keep him warm. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, the truck groaning in protest against the cold. The road to Silverton was long and winding, cutting through thick forests and stretching across icy ridges. The town was small, a quiet place, nestled between the mountains, where everyone knew everyone, or at least they used to. Ethan hadn't set foot in Silverton in 5 years. As they drove, Max lay still, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never left the window. He watched the trees blur past, his ears twitching at the occasional gust of wind. Ethan stole glances at him now and then, still struggling to comprehend it all. "Where have you been?" he murmured, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "How did you find me?" Max didn't answer, of course, but he didn't need to. The fact that he was here was already an answer in itself. A ghost from the past. The moment the old man lifted his head and saw Ethan, his eyes narrowed in recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," Henry muttered, setting his coffee down. "I didn't think I'd ever see you walk through that door again." Ethan cleared his throat. "I need answers." Henry arched a brow. "That's so. And what's got you crawling out of that cabin of yours after all these years?" Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Max to walk into view. Henry's reaction was immediate. "No way, Max." The story of a dog who never stopped searching. Henry stood there for a long moment, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper, something like awe. He finally moved, walking around the desk, his gaze never leaving Max. "I thought he was long gone," Henry murmured, kneeling to get a closer look. "I haven't seen this dog in years." Ethan folded his arms. "What do you mean?" Henry let out a slow exhale, running a hand over his greying beard. "After Anna signed the adoption papers, we were supposed to hold him for pickup, but you never came. A week later, he ran off. Just disappeared." Ethan swallowed hard. "And no one ever found him?" Henry shook his head. "That's the thing. People did find him, plenty of times. He would show up in different places, sometimes miles away. Folks tried taking him in, but he always ran, never stayed put, always heading toward the mountains." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. "He was looking for me?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Henry nodded solemnly. "That's what we always figured. He didn't belong to anyone else, didn't want to. I swear it was like he had a purpose, like he was chasing something." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced down at Max, who sat patiently by his feet, as if waiting for him to understand. 5 years, all for a man who never even knew he was supposed to come. Henry let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn dog wouldn't stop. Guess he finally found his way home, huh?" Ethan swallowed against the overwhelming wave of emotion building in his chest. He had spent so long believing that nothing was waiting for him in this world, that he had lost everything worth holding on to. But Max had never believed that. Max had kept looking against all odds, and now Ethan had no choice but to face the truth. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. More than coincidence. The weight of it all settled deep into Ethan's bones as they drove back toward the mountains. The road ahead was familiar, the path leading home clearer than it had ever been. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his thoughts swirling. There were still too many questions, too many things that shouldn't have been possible. One that refused to leave him. He glanced at Max, who now sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked, eyes full of quiet wisdom. A dog couldn't have done this. Not without help. Ethan's hands loosened, his gaze flickering toward the snow-covered peaks ahead. For the first time in years, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, in the stillness of the winter air, he whispered, "God, was this you?" The drive back from Silverton was quiet. The winding road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by towering pines dusted in fresh snow. The sky had shifted to a soft grey, clouds thickening, as if the world itself was pausing, holding its breath. Ethan's mind was just as clouded. 5 years. Max had spent 5 winters, 5 unforgiving seasons, chasing something he didn't even know for sure existed. Most animals, most people would have given up. But Max hadn't. He had searched, persisted, endured. It shouldn't have been possible. Ethan stole a glance at the dog sitting beside him in the passenger seat. Max wasn't watching the road. He was watching him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something deeper than mere disbelief. This wasn't just a dog's loyalty, this was something greater, something like faith. A silent call. By the time they reached home, the storm clouds had started to break apart, allowing thin rays of sunlight to pierce through. The cabin stood as it always had, unchanged, untouched. But Ethan felt different as he stepped inside. For years he had convinced himself that isolation was easier, that detaching from the world meant he couldn't lose anything more. But the moment Max had stepped into his life, that belief had cracked. This dog had searched for him against all odds. Why? Ethan set his keys on the table, rubbing a hand down his face. His gaze drifted to the small wooden cross still hanging above the fireplace. It had been there since the day he moved in, yet it had become nothing more than decoration over the years. Once, a long time ago, he had prayed in this cabin. He had whispered Anna's name in the quiet, pleaded with God for answers, for healing. But when she was taken from him, he had turned his back. Now, standing there with Max resting at his feet, Ethan felt something unfamiliar clawing at his chest. Was it guilt? He grabbed his coat. Max lifted his head in alert. "We're going somewhere," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "Come on." Max needed no further instruction. He stood, stretched, and followed Ethan outside without hesitation. The church he left behind. The town of Silverton was quiet when Ethan pulled up in front of the old St. Mark's Church. It was smaller than he remembered, its once bright white walls now faded from years of harsh winters. The bell tower loomed above, untouched yet somehow welcoming. Ethan hesitated before stepping out of the truck. His feet felt heavy as if some part of him resisted. But Max sat patiently beside him, unwavering, just as he had always been, just as he had been for 5 years. Ethan swallowed hard, then placed a hand on Max's head before walking toward the church doors. It had been so long since he'd stood here. The last time, he had been a different man, a broken man, blinded by grief, too angry to hear anything but his own pain. He had walked out that day, telling himself he'd never return. Yet here he was. He took a breath, then pushed the doors open. The light that never went out. The church was empty, save for the faint scent of old wood and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns along the pews. And there, at the front of the church, was a single candle, still burning. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't supposed to be there, and yet here it was, still burning, as if it had never gone out. He stepped forward slowly, drawn to it, his heart pounding against his ribs. Max padded beside him, silent, as if he too understood that something sacred was unfolding. Ethan stared at the flickering flame. For so long he had believed God had abandoned him, that there had been no mercy, no reason, no purpose in Anna's death, that he had been left to drift alone, forgotten. But now Max had found him, just like this light. But deep down he knew the truth. He had been the one to turn away. He had been the one to let go. And yet, through it all, God had never left him. His throat tightened. Slowly, deliberately, he sank onto one of the pews. The familiar creak of the wood beneath him was like an old song he hadn't heard in years. His hands trembled as he clasped them together. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Lord, you never left me, did you?" A silence settled around him, not empty but full. A presence, a knowing, a peace he hadn't felt in years. He exhaled, his shoulders sinking, his head bowing. Max lay down at his feet, his body warm against Ethan's legs, as if guarding him, as if watching over him, just as he had for 5 years. And for the first time in a long, long time, he prayed. The road back to the cabin felt different this time. For 5 years, every journey had felt like an escape, every mile putting more distance between Ethan and the life he had abandoned. But now, with Max beside him, the path ahead no longer felt like a retreat. The truck rumbled over the snowy road, the mountain air crisp and sharp against the windshield. Ethan glanced at Max, who sat in the passenger seat, his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the landscape as if he recognized it. "You knew, didn't you?" Ethan muttered, barely realizing he had spoken out loud. Max didn't move, but something in his quiet presence answered for him. Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening on the wheel. This dog had never given up, not on the search, not on the journey and not on him. And for the first time in years, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to give up either. The cabin that no longer felt empty. By the time they arrived, the late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the peaks, streaking the sky with orange and gold. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop, letting the engine idle for a moment before finally cutting it off. The silence was familiar, but it no longer felt so heavy. Stepping out, Ethan stretched, inhaling deeply, the cold biting at his lungs. It was the same air, the same view, but he felt different. He opened the door for Max, who jumped down from the seat with more ease than before. His strength had returned, but his focus remained the same. He didn't sniff around or hesitate. He simply walked to the cabin's porch, as if he had always belonged there. Ethan followed, boots crunching against the snow. He hesitated at the threshold, looking around at the trees, the fading sunlight, the endless stretch of white beyond his land. For years this place had felt like a prison. Now it felt like something else entirely. An inscription that needed to be finished. Once inside, the warmth of the fire greeted them. Ethan shed his coat, glancing at the cabin that had been his shelter for so long. The furniture was the same, the flickering glow of the fire casting the same shadows on the walls, but it no longer felt like a place to hide. Max sat near the hearth watching him, always watching. Ethan moved toward the wooden table, reaching into his pocket. His fingers curled around cold metal, pulling out Max's collar. He had kept it with him all day, the weight of it pressing against his palm, the name etched into its surface a constant reminder. Ethan Carter. He traced the engraving with his thumb. When he had first seen it, it had sent a chill through him, something unsettling, something inexplicable. But now he knew exactly what he needed to do. Ethan grabbed a small pocket knife from the drawer and steadied the collar on the table. The blade pressed into the metal, his strokes slow, deliberate. When he finished, he sat back, running his fingers over the words. Finally home. The phrase settled deep inside him. Home. He hadn't allowed himself to believe in that word for a long time, but as he looked at the freshly engraved letters, at the flickering firelight reflecting off the metal, he knew it was true. The words that had been waiting. Ethan turned to Max, the collar still in his hands. You never gave up on me, he murmured, even when I did. Max didn't react right away. He simply watched, listened. Then, after a long moment, he stepped forward, pressing his nose into Ethan's hand, right where the collar rested. Ethan swallowed hard. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that he was meant to be alone, that he had lost everything worth holding on to. But this dog, this impossible, relentless, loyal dog, had proved him wrong. Ethan knelt, slipping the collar back around Max's neck. His fingers brushed against the metal one last time before fastening it in place. It was more than a name now. It was a promise. Max had finally found his way home, and for the first time in 5 years, so had Ethan. The morning came gently, the soft glow of dawn spilling through the cabin windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Ethan stretched, his body stiff from years of restless sleep, but today felt different. There was no heavy weight pressing on his chest, no lingering emptiness gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. For the first time in 5 years, he woke up not just to exist, but to live. Max lay curled up near the fireplace, his breath steady, his coat gleaming in the morning light. He had recovered quickly over the past few days, his strength returning with each warm meal and restful night. It was remarkable, really, how resilient he was. Ethan watched him for a moment before getting up, pulling on his worn-out flannel jacket. There was a town waiting for him. Stepping back into the world. The road to Silverton felt shorter than before. Maybe it was the clear sky, or maybe it was just his state of mind. Either way, the once familiar town no longer felt like a distant, forgotten place. It felt like somewhere he belonged. The first stop was the general store. Ethan hadn't been inside in years, always opting to order what little he needed online or driving to the next town over to avoid conversation. But now, as he stepped through the doors, the bell overhead chimed, and heads turned. At first there was silence. Then, "Well, I'll be damned," a voice called out. Ethan turned to see Tom Whitaker, the store owner, standing behind the counter, his bushy eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Didn't think I'd see you walk through these doors again," Tom said, setting down a crate of canned goods. Ethan offered a small nod. "Needed to restock a few things." Tom studied him for a moment before smirking. "Restocking supplies or finally restocking your life?" Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Maybe a little of both." Tom leaned against the counter. "Heard about what happened. That dog of yours, he's been the talk of the town." Ethan stiffened slightly. "Yeah?" "Oh yeah, word travels fast around here. Henry at the shelter said that dog's been looking for you for 5 years. That's not just luck, Ethan. That's something bigger." Ethan didn't respond right away, instead grabbing a bag of coffee beans off the shelf. He knew what Tom meant. He had felt it too. Max's journey wasn't just coincidence. It was something more. Before leaving, Tom clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "It's good to see you, Carter. Don't disappear again." Ethan nodded, and for the first time in a long while, he meant it. Returning to the shelter. The next stop was Silverton Animal Rescue. Ethan hadn't planned on going back so soon, but something pulled him towards the place. Maybe it was the thought of all the animals waiting inside, creatures who, like Max, had been abandoned but still held onto hope. When he stepped through the doors, Henry was in the middle of tending to a litter of puppies, his old hands moving with the familiarity of someone who had spent decades caring for the forgotten. "Back so soon?" Henry asked, glancing up. Ethan shrugged. "Figured I'd lend a hand." Henry raised an eyebrow. "You? Volunteering?" Ethan smirked. "Miracles happen, don't they?" Henry chuckled. "Guess they do." And just like that, Ethan Carter became a part of something again. He started slow, helping clean kennels, walking the dogs, checking medical charts with Henry. But each day felt easier than the last. The weight of grief didn't disappear overnight, but it became lighter when he focused on something beyond himself. One afternoon, as Ethan was adjusting a food bowl for an elderly retriever, Henry leaned against the doorway and watched him. "You know," he said casually, "I could use another set of hands around here. We're always short-staffed." Ethan paused, looking up. "You offering me a job?" Henry smirked. "I'm offering you a purpose." Ethan considered that. 5 years ago he had been a vet, someone who had dedicated his life to healing animals, and then he had let it all slip away. Maybe it was time to reclaim that. "I'll think about it," he said, but deep down he already knew the answer. A town that hadn't forgotten him. As the days passed, Ethan found himself reconnecting with people he had long since abandoned. He stopped by the diner for coffee and ended up staying for an hour, catching up with Maggie, the waitress who used to know his usual order. He helped an old friend, Mike Callahan, fix a broken fence near the edge of town, sharing quiet conversations as they worked. And every time he walked through town, people didn't just see him, they welcomed him back. The fear of returning, of facing the world after so many years, had been worse than the reality. People hadn't forgotten him. They had just been waiting for him to come home. The dog that changed everything. Through it all, Max remained by his side. Every morning he was there, waiting by the truck, tail wagging, ready for the day. Every night he lay by the fireplace, his presence a silent reminder that Ethan was no longer alone. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the mountains, Ethan reached down, running a hand through Max's thick fur. "You did more than find me," he murmured. "You brought me back." Max leaned into his touch, a quiet exhale escaping him, as if he understood. Ethan looked out over the land, the place that had once felt so empty, now filled with possibility. For 5 years he had been lost. For 5 years he had refused to let anyone in. But Max had never stopped believing in him. And because of that, he had found his way back. A new beginning, one he never thought he'd get, but one he would never take for granted again. Spring arrived like a quiet promise, melting away the last remnants of winter. The snow that had once buried the land gave way to patches of earth, revealing the sleeping grass beneath. The mountains, once shrouded in icy silence, now hummed with the gentle sound of melting streams and the distant call of birds returning home. Ethan stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. The air smelled different, fresh, alive. The kind of air that carried the feeling of renewal, of something being restored. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just watching the world change, he was a part of it. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and as he took a slow breath, he found himself lifting his gaze toward the sky. The blue stretched endlessly above him, open and vast, and in that moment, Ethan knew he had never been alone. Even in the darkest nights, even in the bitterest storms, even when he had turned his back on everything, God had been there, watching, waiting, guiding him home. A dog's happiness, a man's gratitude. The sound of paws against the wooden porch pulled him from his thoughts. Max trotted up beside him, his tail wagging, his body full of life. There was no hesitation in his movements anymore, no stiffness from the cold, no exhaustion weighing him down. He was strong, whole. He had done what no one thought possible. He had survived, he had searched, he had found Ethan. And now he was home. Ethan knelt down, running a hand over Max's thick coat, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. "You did it," he murmured. "You brought me back." Max pressed his head against Ethan's chest, a deep, content sigh escaping him. For a long moment, they simply stayed there, man and dog, survivor and savior, the lost and the found. Ethan exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're home, Max." And for the first time in 5 long years, Ethan truly felt it. Home wasn't just a place, it was faith restored. It was hope rekindled. It was a journey finally complete. And this time he wasn't walking it alone. No matter how far we stray, love and loyalty will always lead us home. God never abandons us. He watches, he waits, and he sends us signs, small and quiet, guiding us back to where we belong. If you believe in miracles, share this story and spread the light and love of God. What do you think about Max's incredible journey? Have you ever experienced a moment that felt like a sign from above? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and spread the message of hope and faith.